So video game preservation has been a hot topic recently. I think it really got set off when that Ubisoft game called The Crew, it's like a racing game, was essentially delisted. This is like an always online live service game. Yeah, and about a year ago, Ubisoft announced that they were basically taking it offline for good. So yeah, this started a pretty big movement that is geared towards basically preserving games. Like, there is a very interesting statistic that I keep seeing. I remember seeing this a while ago that I still can't really forget. It is the 87% statistic. Basically, 87% of video games that were released before the year 2010 are completely unavailable through like legitimate means of purchasing, and the only ways to get your hands on them these days are either to, one, purchase it for probably a high price on a website like eBay or a garage sale or, something like that. You'd have to go through a complicated process just to buy it, or two, emulating it. Now, this brings to question, what are we doing? What are we as a society doing to sort of preserve these video games? It might sound odd, but they are, in a sense, going extinct. I mean, obviously, extinct probably isn't the best term. Video games are made every day, but, these old video games, we can't actually obtain them anymore through legitimate means. So that's why there has been this very big sort of effort to preserve these video games. And one thing that was very interesting that I've seen recently is this idea that there should be a sort of like library format to preserve these games. I mean, after all, libraries, physically libraries exist for books and movies, and sometimes these physical libraries go beyond that. Sometimes they are in a digital format. So anyway, yeah, there's been a big effort to do just that. But about 6 months ago, unfortunately, there was a pretty big announcement, I guess. I made a video on this. This was in April. The ESA, or the Entertainment Software Association, was basically rejecting these efforts. Now, the ESA, they are made up of the top game publishers in the world, mainly the United States, but just throughout the entire world. Now, it was kind of obvious why they took this position. It was a bit of a biased position, I guess you could say, because they basically said, hey, we could be at a disadvantage to this. People could sort of abuse these game preservation efforts and use these libraries to basically play these games for free rather than to use them for, I guess, preservation or research-like purposes. So that was maybe more of a given, right? That was maybe more of an obvious thing that game publishers would not support this. But now something bigger, and unfortunately I would say much worse, has happened. The US Copyright Office has now came out and basically said the same thing, that they are denying these game preservation efforts. I guess this has been an effort that has now been going on for about 3 years now. This has been a big effort pushed by something called the Video Game History Foundation, as well as the Software Preservation Network. Now, these two associations basically were supporting this library format. But unfortunately, mainly the ESA I am seeing, which again is made up of these big publishers, they made these big arguments that essentially these game preservation efforts were going to be used for recreational purposes. There was an interesting quote from this, actually not even from the ESA, from the US Copyright Office, where they were basically totally supporting, they were in favor of the ESA's idea here. So the final ruling by the US Copyright Office has a statement in it that says, quote, there would be a significant risk that preserved video games would be used for recreational purposes. Yeah, essentially they're saying, well, that's great that you want to preserve these video games in a sort of library, but we're not going to allow that because we can't make these sort of exceptions for copyright just for preservation and research purposes, because it's going to get abused for recreational purposes. People are going to emulate it, and then they're not going to, actually purchase these games legally. Which, to that, I think that's a bit goofy, because, I mean, already people are emulating games for this exact reason. People think of a game from the 90s or the early 2000s. They can't purchase it. For some reason, the publishers, don't even allow for like a digital purchase of the game, so they emulate it. That is essentially, in my opinion, what the US Copyright Office is saying, that overall, I would say, is influenced by a sort of fear-mongering, that this is going to lead to a sort of chaos where games are never purchased, and therefore game publishers don't get any revenue that they should be getting. So I really like the efforts here by the Video Game History Foundation and the Software Preservation Network. Unfortunately, though, this deal or this sort of idea that has has been pushed for the past 3 years by them has now been struck down. I do hope, though, that this has really began a very big overall conversation on efforts to preserve games. I really hope and I really think that this movement is far from over.